Good morning.
I'm Vicki.
Nice to meet you. Well, you've already been
On Zoom.
We're going to get started in just 1 second, but I would ask everyone to please silence your cell phones.
Since we have name tags, we could take a coffee line.
Okay.
Okay? Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final presentation of the 2021 ACEC New York Fall Conference. To everyone joining us virtually, welcome. We hope you all will find this presentation valuable and insightful. I am Rick Satola, partner of Lyra Consulting Structural Engineers and chair of ACEC New York. Before we begin, there's a content warning about the following presentation. We will be showing images and video that some of our attendees may find upsetting. So if you need to step away, feel free to. The effects of 9/11 tragedy in New York, Washington, D.C., and Shanksville touched us even 20 years later. It is important to never forget the events of that day, and we acknowledge that the wounds created by the tragedy will never quite heal for many of us, especially for New Yorkers. We have a distinguished panel here today who will provide unique insight. Carla Bonacci has 38 years of experience as program executive, manager, and architect with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, including the past 33 years planning, designing, and constructing projects at the World Trade Center pre and post 9/11. As the Assistant Director of WTC Infrastructure and Project Development, Carla leads a team comprised of agency staff, AEC consultants, and contractors to establish and deliver public space and urban infrastructure projects, including the WTC campus, streetscape, and WTC of Liberty Park. Carla also administers design and construction, review and oversight of the World Trade Center's third-party private development and tenant construction projects, including office tower and retail base building and interior fit-out through occupancy. Our second panelist, Vicki Arbitrio, is an associate partner with Gilsons Murray Stefacek, a structural engineering and building envelope consulting firm. Vicki is a past chair for the ACEC New York Metropolitan Region Board of Directors. She is a past president of the Applied Technology Council, it's ATC, a not-for-profit organization that develops and promotes state-of-the-art, user-friendly engineering resources and applications for use in mitigating effects of natural and other hazards on the built environment. Michael Burton is recognized industry leader with more than 30 years experience. At Lyra, Michael spearheads the efforts for national expansion and new market opportunities, playing a critical role in extending Lyra's reach in California, the Gulf Coast, and the Caribbean. He also serves as project executive for numerous significant projects, including national disaster recovery, resiliency programs, and the Northeast's largest higher education and healthcare research projects. Other noteworthy programs include the recent multi-billion-dollar Hurricane Sandy responses in New York and New Jersey, and Mike's leadership for historic response to the 9/11 World Trade Center recovery in New York and the Hurricane Katrina recovery in Louisiana. Najib Aboud has more than 20 years of experience in applied mechanics, research and development, structural and computational engineering, and vulnerability assessments and mitigations. As leader of Thornton Tomasetti Applied Science Practice, he directs the firm's research and advanced analysis efforts, which encompasses everything from solving problems related to the safety of military platforms, critical infrastructure, tall buildings, industrial and petrochemical plants, and automotive and airborne vehicles to develop scientific software whose application go beyond the built environment. He served as PM for the multidisciplinary investigation of the World Trade Center collapse and has applied sophisticated nonlinear analysis to other collapse investigations, establishing the firm's leadership in the field. And lastly, Jeffrey Smilo was an associate in my firm when I joined out of college. He began his career with WSP in 1984 and now has over 45 years of experience in structural engineering with an extensive background in the design and renovation of a wide range of structural steel and concrete projects. He has designed high-rise structures, long-span structures, stadiums, renovations of existing buildings. His work in New York City includes the Citi Field Stadium, which is the home of the New York Mets, World Trade Center Tower 3, 55 Hudson Yards, a first of its kind and highly innovative post-tensioned office tower, and 50 Hudson Boulevard, a state-of-the-art 1,000-foot tall commercial tower adjacent to the Hudson Yards. And again, I'm Rick Satola. I'm a partner with Lyra Consulting Engineers. I was partner in charge of Lyra's ongoing contract with the Port Authority World Trade Department from 1996 through May 30th, 2002, when the city turned the site back over to the Port Authority and the developers, Silverstein. Today, Carla and I will present a bit of the history of the World Trade Center project. She and I will then follow with remembrances of the day. Then Vicki and Mike will talk about the engineering community's role in the recovery of the site. Najib will then talk about the collapse analysis of the towers. And to bring us to the present, Carla will come back and Jeff will talk about the rebirth of the complex. So Carla, could you please begin by telling us a little bit about the original World Trade Center complex?
Good morning. Let me get my clicker. Good morning, everyone. And you're probably wondering, as I'm an architect and a planner, what I'm doing here at a conference for engineers talking about engineering. And that's going to be the test question at the end of the day. You'll tell me how I did. But I do thank Rick for inviting me to talk professionally and personally about the World Trade Center, where I've spent 3 decades of my career spanning, as he said, planning, designing, constructing, and mourning, and then rebuilding, and again. So it is really a passion for me and a part of my life. I'm also representing the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which owns the World Trade Center site and has municipal jurisdiction over that entire area, which is sometimes people don't actually understand that. And I also want to acknowledge that not only is the Port Authority celebrating its 100-year centennial, but so is ACEC. And then it's our 20th anniversary commemorating 9/11. But isn't it interesting that, you know, our two organizations are always together, hand in glove, and I think that speaks to the importance of engineering in everything that the Port Authority does as it builds. So I think I'm in the right place today. So let's see if I can do this. It's going to take you back to iconic architecture and symbolism, and I want you to think about this as it dawned on me the other day. It's been 60 years since the World Trade Center was an idea, and history books recount all the details. So the abridged version is that the 2 New York Rockefeller men had an idea to reinvigorate Lower Manhattan, and the state of New Jersey had an idea to refurbish the Hudson and Manhattan railway system. And lo and behold, the Port Authority with Austin Tobin and his, head man, Guy Tizzoli, took the charge and had a dream to build something that would be better and bigger than anything anywhere, and to really make New York something special. And with that, they hired Minoru Yamasaki, a Japanese-American architect out of Detroit, with this huge program of 10 million square feet to come and design this complex. Along with that, he really needed a team, and they hired local firms and men, Les Robertson, Joe Loring, and their firms, and I know some of you here today represent those firms. And that was a great collaboration and ultimately created the World Trade Center that we had. And so those Twin Towers have really been an important part of all of our lives, probably, in this audience, and at least for me, from the time of being a young child. The other point I wanted to make was the Koning Sphere, which is an important sculpture. And you may not realize that the Trade Center had several important sculptures by artists from the Axis powers of World War II. And I thought this was really fascinating when I learned this a long, long time ago. The Koning Sphere by Koning was from Germany. We had a Rossetti sculpture by an Italian, and we had the Nagari by a Japanese. So what was really important, I think, to Yamasaki, I believe to the Port Authority, was the idea that this complex could represent world peace, and that was a way. And when you think back, you know, World War II ending, maybe was that like 15 years from the 60s? So think of us today, it was pretty fresh in their minds, and yet this was something important to them. I also want to talk about context and some planning principles. At the time of this idea and this design, there really wasn't a neighborhood around Lower Manhattan in this section. What Yamasaki did was to create a superblock. It was an important planning principle. There were two important planning principles in the 60s, the superblock and sky bridges. A superblock is essentially a place that is self-contained and looks inward. And as you can see, the central plaza was a 5-acre plaza. It was lifted about 5.5 feet off the street, and the buildings surrounded that plaza. So it was very much a place that was self-contained. I think the other interesting thing to note is because of the topography of the site, from Church Street to West Street, which is about 1,000 feet, there was a 20-foot change in elevation. And so what a lovely way to deal with that, by lifting it and making a flat plane and creating a pedestrian environment separate from the vehicles. And that's the other reason why sky bridges were also important at that time. There was a belief that pedestrians should be separate from vehicles, and the way you could do that was to create a sky bridge. So over time, Bankers Trust, there was a connection from Bankers Trust to the Trade Center. There were 2 bridges from the World Financial Center. There was a bridge from 7 World Trade Center. And again, this development took about 20 years. So people may not realize that from the first building, we always talk about the opening in 71, to the last building, which was the hotel. And it was really over 20 years before it was fully established. Let's talk a little bit about common infrastructure. Everyone sees the Twin Towers, they see the Central Plaza. What oftentimes they didn't see was all of the workings that allowed this center to thrive. We had large central plants, chiller plants that drew in river water, which was a great engineering innovation at the time. We had a power distribution center and other electrical distribution centers around the complex. There, of course, was the transit system, essential, bringing in around 50,000 people a day. And we had a it's like a vehicle security center. It was really the below-grade servicing and loading dock area for the complex. And the only other location in the city where that was Rockefeller Center. So again, the idea that one hides all of the servicing, those things that the public doesn't always want to see, put it below grade, is really what we did. And below grade, we had around 3 million square feet. So another thing to think about is that was another building. This was a building that people didn't see, but it is really what fed the office towers. And we also had a shopping mall, around 400,000 square feet. So this really was a city within a city, which I'm sure you've often heard throughout the years, but it really was self-contained. What 93 did to us, besides rocking our world, because it was such a travesty and the devastation was so difficult to deal with. And in 93, in that bombing, the public didn't really see the devastation that was caused, that created a 6-story hole, about an acre in size, that went all the way down to bedrock. And so the public really didn't see that. But what that allowed us to do was to initiate a comprehensive plan that we had in the works anyway, because remember, over time, life changed. Technology became more part of our lives. We had cell phones, they were flip phones. We had the little Nextels and the pagers, and computers were becoming really more a part of our everyday life. At least I remember it was such a big deal when the little Macintosh Apple showed up in our offices, and we were trying to convince people we should have, we should have a Mac, not just the regular old, other PC computer. So things were changing, and our tenants and customers needed more power. So we went and increased the power from 4 watts a square foot to 10 watts a square foot. We built a baby chiller plant. We called it a baby chiller plant, so that now we had 60,000 tons of cooling for this complex. We also sprinklerized the concourse, and we had a program to upgrade all the public spaces. At this time, we did have a neighborhood around us. We had Battery Park City and offices to the south and north. We created new connections in that underground mall that allowed people to enter more fluidly and also exit more fluidly, which ended up being important even in 2001, sorry. So that was our way to really upgrade the center and bring it into current times and reestablish it. And just what I wanted to say, because we did all of those improvements, we ended up having a very strong center that was 95% leased, what we consider fully occupied. We had 50,000 people a day working there. We had close to 100,000 people traveling through, visiting the observation deck, eating at Windows on the World. We had redone the public space. The plaza was really beautiful. We were striving for 24/7 entertainment, and we did have a lot of cultural events for the infrastructure that we could support at that time. And I like to say we're at the top of our game. And then, of course, September 10th was a great day, but not September 11th. So with that, that's an abridged version of our history through time, just to set the tone and the context for what you'll hear later in this program.
Thank you, Carla. So just in case Carla's presentation didn't already make this clear enough, let me simply say that the planning and development of the original World Trade Center towers was an audacious undertaking by the Port Authority. They weren't real estate developers on any scale. They were developers and operators of bi-state port and transportation facilities. And here, they set out to build a center for international commerce with the goal of reinforcing New York's position as the commercial capital of the world. They weren't real estate developers, but here they would build twin 110-story towers, the tallest towers in the world at the time. They weren't real estate developers, but here they would locate the tallest towers in the world in one of the windiest spots in New York, Lower Manhattan. To further put this into context, the Empire State Building was completed in 1929, just 35 years earlier. After the Empire State Building was completed, there was the Great Depression, there was World War II, 15 years of global turmoil. It took until the 1950s before real estate market got back on its feet. Nothing approaching the scale of the Empire State Building was completed through the 50s and the early 60s. And when large projects started hitting the drawing boards in the 60s, real estate development economics were so different from what they were 35 years earlier. The same design and construction techniques were completely infeasible. For this project to be feasible, it would require norm-shattering innovations. And I have forgot to advance slides. Sorry. Yet the Port Authority, as I said, they weren't real estate developers. What audacity. Okay, sorry. To pull the project off, Port Authority assembled an incredible team led by Minoru Yamasaki Architects on the design side, Tishman Construction on the construction side. ACEC New York boasts at least 3 member firms with prominent design roles: Lyra, Loring, and JB&B. So let's look at some of these design and construction innovations, many of which would become commonplace in today's high-rise design and construction. A source of what I'm going to be presenting today is from the book, The Structure of Design and an Engineer's Extraordinary Life in Architecture by Leslie E. Robertson. Les Robertson is the LER of LERA, so I will be speaking about innovations he influenced. He makes clear in his book that implementing these innovations required efforts and boldness of the entire owner, designer, and construction team. Another source of what I'm going to present today is the mentoring that I and my colleagues received directly from Les over 35 years. Youth was given the opportunity to flourish on this innovative project. Les, who was in his mid-30s at the time directing the structural work, paraphrases in his book, totally demanding of one's energies and talents, this was a young person's project. This was not a place for people who knew where they were going. Instead, it was for those of us intent on discovering where to go. We set out to design modern buildings, standing on the past, but taking a new step forward, making full use of the latest technologies, even where we had to devise them. Perimeter tube structure. The revolutionary superstructure concept was that of a perimeter tube, where the perimeter walls resisted all of the lateral forces in wind and earthquake while carrying all the vertical loads tributary to the perimeter wall. The core, containing elevators, stairs, mechanical shafts, restrooms, and other back-of-house spaces, was a little more conventional construction. The perimeter tube interconnected to the core with long-span floor framing. allowed virtually all rentable space between the core and the perimeter wall to be column-free. Fosler Kahn of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill is credited as the father of tube construction. However, Les writes that his team's use of perimeter tube was developed independently of and parallel with Dr. Kahn's team. Outrigger Space Truss. It's the outrigger space frame at the very top of the building, extending from the perimeter tube to the core columns, stiffened the structure by mobilizing the core columns in lateral resistance. These trusses also supported the antenna mast on the north tower and gave the option of a second antenna mast on the south tower. Today, outriggers are commonly employed in tall buildings worldwide. Wind engineering. Planning and design commenced in 1963 under the 1938 New York City Building Code. The outdated provisions of this code would have required wind pressures of only 20 psf from the height of 100 feet above grade to the top of the building. And below 100 feet, remarkably, no wind pressure at all. The 1968 Building Code, which was adopted during the design of the World Trade Center, updated the prior deficient wind pressures. However, the update was still a simple prescriptive design pressure. It gave no consideration to extreme height, extreme siting, or building-specific response to the wind forces. With the tallest building in the world to be constructed on one of the windiest sites in Manhattan, the team realized that it had to break from prescriptive and wind pressures and revolutionize wind engineering. It started by mounting a comprehensive program to determine the design level gradient wind speed specific to New York City. This is the wind speed high enough above ground where surface roughness on the ground doesn't significantly, so as to not significantly slow the ground surface roughness. To do this, meteorological data around New York was obtained, and full-scale measurements of wind speeds were obtained by placing anemometers on nearby buildings. With this data, the next step was to use a boundary layer wind tunnel study, a nascent field of study that was not used in practice for building design. With this data, the next step was to use it as a boundary layer wind tunnel. The construction of the new wind tunnel was commissioned for the project. So for the first time, a building had been analyzed for steady state and dynamic wind components and wind-induced deflections on the structure, all under the influence of a site-specific turbulent wind. This is now standard practice in the design of high-rise buildings worldwide. Prefabrication of structural steel. The project would not have been feasible with piece-by-piece construction practices commonly used at the time and still used today. Prefabrication of structural steel to a degree not used in high-rise construction was needed in order to make this project feasible and speed erection. Les drew his experience as a young engineer, where he helped to design the IBM building in Pittsburgh, a building whose exterior diagrid wall, also a first, by the way, it featured prefabricated panelization. For the World Trade Center exterior tube, exterior two-column panels were 3 stories tall and 3 columns wide. Prefabricated floor trusses were 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, comprising 6 trusses, metal floor deck, and an electrical distribution system. Computerized purchasing and fabrication of structural steel. Procurement of structural steel for such a massive project could not occur in the usual ways. Les writes that probably for the first time, structural design for a high-rise building was provided to the contractor in a digital format. A computerized system was conceived and developed for ordering structural steel, for producing the structural steel shop drawings, and as well for operation of computer-operated fabrication equipment, all directly from digital information developed as part of the design process. All of this in the 1960s. Motion simulation. Wind engineering augmented by the wind tunnel study gave a realistic understanding of how much a building would oscillate, but there was really no understanding of how much the oscillation would affect human occupants. To test this, the team designed and built a mechanical motion simulator that replicated the lateral sway motion of the towers and measured the response of persons to it. As this was a sensitive issue, the tests were done in Oregon, away from the media of New York. Port Authority, perhaps not fully trusting of this contraption, conducted a motion simulator test using a pendulum simulator to simulate the long 10-second frequency of oscillation of the towers. The pendulum had to be really, really long. It was so long that they constructed it in a ventilation shaft of one of the Hudson River crossings. The pendulum testing corroborated the mechanical simulator, and the mechanical simulator was used in the design of the towers. Structural damping. Damping of an oscillating building is primarily what causes the oscillations to diminish and eventually stop. Think of a shock absorber in your car that diminishes the bounce of the suspension springs. An oscillating body has kinetic energy, and damping is the characteristic of that body that absorbs the energy, thus diminishing the amplitude of the oscillation. The normal physical makeup of a building, any building, its bones, its floor, its skin, its interior partitions, when deforming under wind load, all give it what we call natural damping characteristics. All buildings have this. The towers, with their very efficient design and lightweight architectural finishes, had a relatively low level of natural damping. The previously discussed wind tunnel study showed that its natural damping alone would not control oscillation sufficiently. So the design team designed, for the first time in the building structure, engineered structural damping devices to supplement the natural damping of the building and thereby control oscillations. Each tower had 10,000 of these dampers. And other innovations, which I won't go into detail, the project was the first use of a shaft wall system in elevator mechanical shafts. A statistical analysis of glass breakage on this very tall building was done. And the internal stack pressures of a tall building were studied for the first time. This is well publicized. Recognizing their height, the location on the southern tip of Manhattan, their owners, the Port Authority, were the stewards of the 3 major airports in New York City. The towers were prudently designed for the impact of a Boeing 707, one of the most common domestic jetliners of the time. The idea was that the jetliner, lost in the fog and flying low and slow, could have a possibility of striking one of the towers. The red arrows depict the impact energy of a 707 relative to a bomber that struck the Empire State Building in 1945, and relative to the 767s that impacted the tower on 9/11. Tremendous difference. They were not designed for 767s flying at extremely high speed, fully laden with jet fuel. The practice of designing jet impact is not common today for building construction. What would you design for? So we have a video for you.
What's going on, Betty? The aircraft is erratic again. Problem, very erratic. Betty, talk to me. Betty, are you there? Betty? Betty?
We have some problems over here right now. We might have a hijack over here, two of them.
Jules, this is Ryan. Listen, on an airplane that's been hijacked, and things will go well. I'm looking good. I just want you to know I absolutely love you. I want you to do good. So have a good time. Same to my parents and everybody. And I just totally love you, and I will see you later. Bye, babe.
What are those people gonna do? All the elevators are blocked out.
I got an aircraft 6 miles east of the White House.
Hello?
Crystal City, just north of Crystal City.
Just to the north of your town.
Yeah, stop all departures.
Pentagon just got hit.
There's a kid.
United 9-3, have you got information on that yet?
Yeah, he's down.
He's down?
Yes.
When did he land?
He did not land.
Oh, he's down?
Yeah,
Down?
somewhere up northeast of Camp David.
Sean, it's me. I just want to let you know I love you, and I'm stuck in this building in New York. There's lots of smoke, and I just wanted you to know that I love you always.
At number 2 World Trade Center, right. Ladies and students in this office, we're not ready to die, but it's getting bad.
I'm on the 83rd floor. I'm going to die, aren't I?
The brutality of the event is indelibly etched in our consciousness. There was so much tragedy in so many stories of that day. There were some 3,000 deaths, countless victims, each with a story. Some of you have stories. Here we offer two. Carla, would you like to go?
Sure, but I'm going to sit, if that's okay. So I'm sure all of you have a recollection of where you were that day. And for me, I've only actually talked about it a couple times. I have to say it took me about 10 years to really verbalize it, although I wasn't in the buildings, and that's maybe my survivor's guilt is why I don't talk about it that much. I think I'm very fortunate. But that morning, as you all know, was a beautiful morning, and the sky was so blue. And I was standing on my platform, a New Jersey Transit platform. My daughter had just started kindergarten, And I was reveling at how blue the sky was, and then I was wondering, where is my train? Why is my train 10 minutes late? New Jersey Transit. It's a perfect day. But I will tell you that I really believe that's why I'm still here, because if I had been on that train, I would have been going into the elevators in my tower, in Tower 1. And, you know, we all know what happened to those folks. I will say, though, that being around at the time on Path and learning that a plane had hit the Trade Center, and I'm only going to give you a few snippets of my journey that morning. I was compelled to go into the city. My staff was there, my colleagues. I had 2 offices at that time, so just to set the context, on the 88th floor, we were in the middle of transitioning the complex to Silverstein Properties, and I was heading up with a group the transition of that design and construction office that they would be running. And I had an office on the 86th floor, Tower 1, with a team that was closing out all the contracts that Silverstein would not be pursuing, and we're finishing those up. And so I really felt the need to be there. I figured out how to get there. A few things. As I was behind 7 World Trade Center and I heard this huge bomb, well, I thought it was a bomb. It was actually 2 World Trade Center falling, and there was debris flying past my face, and I didn't learn till later that that was 2 World Trade Center. I did make my way to the Port Authority Command, which I just knew would be on West Street because that was how we were set up. And just as I got into that van, and my boss, our director, Alan Reese at the time, and I was with Captain Whitaker, I heard this incredible creaking. I can't even really describe it, like fingernails on a chalkboard at a huge decibel level. And I was like, Alan, what is that? And he said, the building's going to fall. And Captain Whitaker said, we got to get out of here. And we jumped out and started running. At one point, I heard them saying, Carla, get down, get down. And as I turn around, I see them hiding behind a Jersey barrier. And I smile because I try to look at humor and everything. And I was in the middle of the street with nowhere to go. And all of a sudden, I see this huge blob rolling toward me. And have any of you ever seen the 60s movie, The Blob? Well, so, you know, it really impacted me as a child. So obviously, this is what I'm seeing. And I'm like, oh my God. And basically, I was engulfed in that. It is, as you hear other folks talk about, everything went black. My throat, everything filled so thick. And I really thought, I don't know that I'm, going to make this one. And when they say your life passes before your eyes, it kind of does. Luckily, mine stopped at a certain point, and the black lifted to gray, to white, and we came out of it. And, I always say then it looked like Planet of the Apes. Everything was white, and we were all covered in debris and soot. But and there's more that happened that day, but those were, I think, impactful moments that I can share with you. And I just also want to say, the Port Authority is such a wonderful organization, and the people there, and the fact that we were able to really recover, get together, figure out how to work through this crisis, to work with the families, to figure out where everyone was. And I did lose one person who worked for me, and that was tragic, as well as the 16 folks in our department who later became first responders, which was very nice, because I think as caretakers of the World Trade Center, we really loved that place. You know, we had all these 50,000 people that we really took care of in very different ways, from how the building systems worked to the activities and the mall, and making sure everything ran smoothly. And I really believe that's why probably I felt compelled, and why those that stayed back to help people were compelled as well. And so that's why I'm here, going to build that place back better than ever, and hopefully nothing like this will happen again. I better be quiet.
No.
Go. Anyway.
Thank you so much, Carla, for sharing a difficult story. Appreciate that. As Carla said, it was an incredibly clear day. We would learn later that airline pilots called it severe clear. I was partner in charge of our ongoing work at the World Trade Center, and I was supposed to have 2 engineers, Billy Howe and Pei Long Yuan, doing inspections that morning from the suspended scaffolding on the north facade of the North Tower. Their inspection was canceled the night before. This would be the location of the first plane impact. Port Authority window washing crew on the roof would perish. We had an office on the 37th floor of the South Tower. Billy and Pei Long chose to work in our main office that day on 30 Broad Street. The South Tower would be the first tower to collapse. I was in our main office at 8 a.m., and our office was on the 48th floor, about 7 blocks from the World Trade Center. I was meeting with an engineer at my desk. We suddenly saw a flurry of snow, not flurry of paper, blow past our window in front of us. Looking out, we saw smoke pouring from the corner of the North Tower. We couldn't see the north facade, so we didn't really know what was going on. And we had no idea what had happened. We thought fire broke out inside, naturally. Someone turned on the radio, and the first reports were that a commuter plane had hit the tower. We still had no idea what really happened. Within about 10 minutes, I received a call from Frank DiMartini, our Port Authority colleague, who had his offices in the North Tower, just floors below the plane impact. His floor was completely wrecked, but apparently it was spared from the conflagration. Frantically on the phone, he yelled, "Rick, there has been a massive explosion. Bring a team of engineers over to assess the damages. Meet me in the lobby of the South Tower." So my team of about 4 engineers, including Billy and Pei Long, and I left the office as quickly as we could and headed toward the south entrance of the South Tower. We were within a couple of blocks when we heard a roar overhead. We looked up, totally confused, to see a jetliner racing across the tops of buildings, just skimming them. Its impact and explosion stunned us into senselessness. I felt an absence of soul. I recall no sound. I don't know how many long, slow seconds ticked by in that stunned silence before recovering my senses. We had only been a minute or so from the main entrance of the South Tower, immediately under the plane's impact. So my team escaped a deadly horror. Billy and Pei Long had escaped their 3rd deadly horror. Our Port Authority colleague, Frank DiMartini, would not survive the day. Well, having recovered our senses, we finally knew what had happened. We finally knew what had happened to the first tower just 18 minutes earlier, and we knew New York was under attack. At that moment, we briefly talked about what to do and decided that the best thing would be to return to our colleagues back in the main office. With the city under attack, 2 towers gashed and burning, we returned to find terror, tears, and bravery among our colleagues. The firm leadership asked everyone in the office to remain until it was clear that it was safe to leave. Then bravery took over. Someone went to nearby deli to get plenty of food and drinks, just in case. A group organized a buddy system so everyone would have a place to go at the end of the day if they couldn't get to their own home. As smoke thickened outside, some taped the perimeter of windows to keep the leaky windows from letting smoke in. Some roamed the office consoling the inconsolable. Some watched the towers burning from our 47th floor conference room, which had a plain view of that ugly wound in the south wall of the South Tower. Screams erupted as some saw the tower fall. That once gorgeous morning descended into an apocalyptic darkness throughout Lower Manhattan. We listened to the frightening but reassuring roar of jet fighters that we couldn't see. They were securing the skies. By mid-afternoon, with our buddy system in place, we felt it was safe enough to evacuate. A group of about 10 of us found escape to Midtown on a New York City Department of Sanitation tugboat. Thank you, New York's strongest. So this is tough stuff. We didn't want to hold any punches. It's a reminder of our collective state of mind facing this insane challenge. But it is at this very time when the design and construction industry of the City of New York and the Port Authority unified to ever so slowly pick away at this insane challenge. Cooperation and confidence emerged from this chaos. And I want to show you a standard issue construction helmet. This is mine. I use it at home. I still use it today. It says, "United we stand." And it was truly a united effort that began the process of recovery and healing. So Vicki and Mike now are going to talk about that beginning process of securing the site.
Good morning. I walked home that Tuesday afternoon. My husband had made it to my office from his office down by South Street Seaport, and we were struck by the fact that we ran into a man trying to get into the post office at 18th Street. And this was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he was like, "Why is the post office closed? What's the deal?" There's this big sign, temporarily closed. We said, "Have you not heard anything?" He said, "No, I just drove down the West Side Highway from upstate. What's going on?" And we couldn't believe what we were hearing. You drove down the West Side Highway and you didn't notice that there was this gaping hole in the skyline, that there was all this smoke. He was like, "No, what happened?" We said, "There was an attack." And this is why, you know, we have to treat each other as humans. We have to take care of each other. And engineers do that. You know, we are trained to figure out how to make things better, and it's what we do. The Structural Engineers Association of New York was created to provide a communal place where we can learn from each other. Yes, Rick and I are competitors, but he's a smart guy. And why should I be banging my head against the wall trying to figure something out instead of just asking him? And the Structural Engineers Association of New York, of California, all across the US, those small groups of very specialized engineers trade information and learn from each other. And in this situation, we worked with each other. So on Wednesday the 13th, I went to work. I was the secretary of SEONI, the Structural Engineers Association of New York. The guy I worked for was the immediate past president, Ramon Gilsanz. Rick Mahoney of McLaren Engineering was the current president. Ed DePaula from Severid was the incoming president. Guy Nordenson, who had practiced in California and knew about the Applied Technology Council's protocol for evaluating buildings immediately after an earthquake. He was a past president now practicing in New York. He had worked at Weidlinger for a time. And I started my email distribution, sending out emails to all the structural engineers in New York saying, we don't know what we need, but we want to know if you're ready to help. So on the 12th, we started sending out emails to gather volunteers, and although they attempted on the 11th to contact Mike in the DDC, on the 12th, Ramon had spoken to Dan Eskenazi of the DDC. We didn't realize that Mike had already reached out to Richard Tomasetti of Thornton Tomasetti, but collectively we knew each other. We weren't treating each other as competitors. We were treating each other as New Yorkers, and we were able to all come together, and whatever we needed, we were going to provide. The GMS offices at the time were at 95 University Place, so on 12th Street. So while the city was shut off below 14th Street, I could show them my business card. I'm a structural engineer. I'm just going to 12th Street. And they would let me through. And they would let other engineers through. And so from 12th Street, for the first week, we ran our offices 24/7. Clients would call and say, I need my shop drawings for my project upstate. Well, sorry, we've got a problem here. We'll get them to you in a week or so. You could walk the 2 miles from GMS down to the World Trade Center. The DDC eventually started using PS 89. Mike showed you the kindergarten chairs yesterday, right? Which was, let's see if I can use my pointer, right about there, right where Stuyvesant High School is, and I think PS 89 is the next block south. By the end of September, we were out of GMS's offices and everybody was going to PS 89. So this was a satellite image from NOAA that we had obtained to just show you what the site looked like. The structural engineers assisted Thornton Tomasetti and LZA, who were assigned to each of the contractor groups that Mike discussed last night, right? And we did several things. We identified unstable areas. We developed so on the lower right, there's temporary stabilization for this 40-foot long piece of steel that's hanging out of this building. identified safe locations where heavy equipment could be placed, designing grillages and reinforcing, developing monitoring programs for adjacent buildings, and then there was the emergency assessments of the buildings in the immediate collapse area. Ultimately, Sioni had approximately 400 to 450 volunteer teams. People drove from Chicago to come help. There were still no flights in or out of the area, but we broke down the region into these zones and inspected every building within this zone. So on September 17th and 18th, we evaluated over 370 buildings using this protocol adopted by the DDC from California. And we color-coded buildings just like we do after Hurricane Sandy, in earthquakes. Green is great to be reoccupied, right? Yellow, blue, there's more damage. We need to do a better assessment there. We need to make sure that it's safe. There's not a 40-foot piece of steel hanging over the entrance that might fall on people, or broken glass, that the entrances, the egress is available. So on September 21st, the 31 yellow, blue, and red buildings were reassessed. Sioni members also volunteered on the American Society of Civil Engineers report. The initial investigation, which was led by Gene Corley, who had also led the investigation after the Oklahoma City bombing. What happened to all these buildings? At that time, the structural engineers from New York also decided, all sorts of steel that might lend valuable clues has already been shipped to Staten Island or New Jersey. So they sent teams out to the scrap yards to identify which pieces might be helpful for future investigations. Najib will talk more about the NIST investigations, but many, many engineers were involved in this. One of the great things that came out of all of this investigation are ways to make buildings safer, and we've implemented that. You all know about the code changes that have happened, right? The increased structural integrity requirements, enhanced fire endurance, improving the fire protection, in addition to improved building evacuation and building egress for emergency responders, right? The National Council of Structural Engineers Associations, the umbrella organization for Sioni in New York and ACEC in California, and all the other 39 states, their Code Advisory Committee has been very involved in trying to figure out ways that we can make buildings safer without making them cost that much more. And they've also worked with all the codes and standards committees. The other thing that came is that we have decided that there really needs to be a national protocol for how structural engineers should respond. And so through the National Council, we're talking to our counterparts across the country. These are devastating photos. It's hard to comprehend, but at the same time, it was horrific. People after the disaster have died and ended up suing engineers because they thought that we were in control of the site. There are no words to explain how sick those people have gotten, but this is the reason that ACEC New York is pushing for emergency responder legislation. So we can talk about this more some other time. But the fact that we all worked together, we collaborated. I might not like Rick, but I respect him. And I think Mike pointed out last night, this was a site that had no additional physical injuries during the recovery, and that is just incredible. So, thank you. Oh, sorry, I think I just started your slides, Mike. You might need to go back.
You can keep going.
No.
Thank you, Vicki. As Vicki made a really very good point, you learn from catastrophes such as earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, sea level rise, record rainfalls, and terrorist attacks as well. And those learning experiences help us improve our best practices. Now, Najib will walk us through some of the studies he did on the collapse mechanisms of the towers. It's a learning process.
Thank you, Rick. Good morning, everyone. Clearly, it's difficult to transition from what is a pretty wrenching depiction of the day and the aftermath, however heroic it was, to now go into an investigation. Let me give a little bit of context. There was litigation, right? No one is particularly tends to celebrate these things, but that litigation, what was known as the one event versus two event litigation, spurred what probably was one of the biggest ever investigations into construction collapse. That was the first investigation that was undertaken by Thornton Tomasetti. NIST was not yet chartered by Congress to become the official investigative body for all future structural collapses. That occurred about a year later. At that point, we provided all the data that we had, and NIST launched its own separate investigation. The totality of those two investigations probably make, from a construction point of view, 9/11, the single most analyzed collapse or calamity in engineering ever studied. And that is significant, right? Don't know if that's quite true. I'm looking for Rick, but probably it took as much effort investigating the collapses as it took to design them. And that's important to understand. The reason is, litigation aside, in the year afterwards, there was real fear in the public in general as to what it means in terms of our skyscrapers or tall buildings in general. Are they safe in general? When we get up in the morning and get into a car, we all have implicitly a sense of the risk that we are taking. We were raised with cars around us. We've been in accidents, seen accidents. We know there is no such thing as a perfectly safe driving experience. Yet few, if any, have experienced a major catastrophe in a building. And engineers, with all the admirations we have for engineers, were terribly bad at communicating with the population at large, right? And that was a big thing that we needed to change. Having said that, okay, so when a bunch of lawyers say, we want to understand how a scientist would figure out the issue of whether two airplanes ramming into two towers constitute a single event or two events. Okay, why does it matter? Insurance pays once or twice. So as far as rebuild, ultimately, that's a huge difference, right? A scientist doesn't look at the intention of the attackers. It looks as to whether the two events are physically linked, okay? So the way we pose the question is whether the collapse of the South Tower, it's the first one to collapse, caused or contributed to the collapse of the North Tower. What's germane to that question is, to address it, you need to understand the progression of the damage, the entire chain of events, the mechanisms of failures, and how the towers ultimately collapsed. If you understand all of that, you can start addressing all kinds of questions as to whether it was preventable or no, inevitable or no, whether there were poor designs or no. And believe it or not, a lot of people at the time raised questions as to the adequacy of the design. Everything that Rick told you was revolutionary about Les's design at the time. Every time Rick says it was never done before, unfortunately, on 9/11 becomes a reason to question that maybe there was something wrong with it. Went through exhaustive investigations of the design itself, of the maintenance of the tower. And Carla can tell you, there is no single towers in the history of mankind that received that kind of maintenance that the two World Trade Center towers did, nor as much documentation as the Lira reports about the maintenance through the years. I won't speak about all those aspects. I will focus on the investigation per se of the collapses. Okay. We could see what's happened to the perimeter tube, right? That's the tube that Rick mentioned in his introduction. But we don't know what's happening inside. This is the first time where it's common for people to have on the street digital photography. The level of detail of exterior documentation we received is unprecedented, yet none of it penetrates really inside. To do that, we need to go back to physics, do everything, essentially decipher the entire evolution of the events by calculating it in milliseconds from the initial attack all the way to the ultimate outcome. There is more than one plausible scenario. They get eliminated by checking physics. They have to satisfy the laws of physics, and they have to satisfy externally observable documentation. Once you put those two constraints, a lot of the theories that were pandered around by professors and other very smart people fall by the wayside. And the most likely occurrence is what I will depict to you. Won't have time to show you the entire investigation. I'll just illustrate the main milestones with the North Tower, WTC-1. Rick showed you this initial impact on the North Tower. Just let it play and then I'll speak to it for a second. The green is the model to capture the airplane. Okay. There's a single footage that captured the hit on the North Tower. It was a documentary movie being filmed about the life of a rookie in the FDNY. And the crew hears the roar of an airplane going behind what used to be an AT&T central building. That's the brownish building to the right. They turn around with the cameras up and they capture the airplane impact. You can't triangulize if you have a single video footage, but using the sound of the airplane and the Doppler effect as it goes behind and emerges behind the AT&T building, we can put all of that information together to come up with estimates of the heading of the airplane, the speed with which it impacted, and the angle of attack. And this is the reconstruction. Based on that data, this is not reenactment, this is physics. 500 miles an hour, as close to cruising altitude speed. You clip about 4 floors between 94 to 98. Notice about 3/4 of the face of the tube. But the heading is pretty much central, straight on. It's not going at an angle across the building. And that ultimately proves to be the single biggest difference between the impact on the North Tower and the impact on the South Tower, okay? So now we know that force, its heading, its speed, its impact. What happened on the outside is visible, right? We will recalculate it, but that serves as a constraint. As a point of comment, this is known as the Raban photograph. It's in the 9/11 museum. The degree of detail, I don't zoom on this picture because there is a person standing there, frankly. If you zoom in enough, you see down to the connection details. That is the degree to which investigation went. As hard as it was for people to be for months on end on site, it was equally hard for people to watch movies and videos like that in great detail for months on end in the service of this investigation. Can I go back? Can you help me go back and click the play button, please? No, it's not working? Okay. So essentially, we had to build a model of an airplane, a 767. And Boeing clearly doesn't release drawings of its airplanes for that purpose. Yet it's very closely aligned with a military jet, the cargo jet that we had the drawings for. That was the beginning of building a model of the airplane. The jets, the Pratt & Whitney jets, are also close surrogates to the actual civilian version of it. And we did finite element models and analyzed the entire impact onto the tower, right? Couple of things you notice. All kinds of questions are legitimate, but some people imagine the airplane going just straight into the space. No, it's thin aluminum sheet. It gets shredded to pieces, okay? However, it doesn't make it any less lethal. You have mass flying at 500 miles an hour, right? For the columns that in the core that were severed, it's easy, they were severed. But this debris field strips all the surviving columns from fireproofing, right? And you're engineers, most of you have had experience with cementitious fireproofing. It doesn't take much to dislodge it. So there was a lot of worry about all cementitious fireproofing is bad. In reality today, no technology, fireproofing technology that we have available to us, including intumescent fireproofing, would survive such a scraping effect. That is the strongest power wash you can ever conceive of. That's what you have to think about. So a lot of the theories that were espoused even 20 years later don't consider that fundamental effect that we simply don't know how to deal with. How do you protect a steel structure from fire, absent fireproofing, right? So to summarize a little bit the damage on the facade, more than 60% of the columns on the face are gone. The concrete slabs are only damaged in the area of impact itself, right? This is a notable feature, and I'll come back to that in a second. Notice the columns that are severed in the center of the core, pretty center, not at the corners of the core, right? About half of them, we estimate, are severed. But now look at everything that will be shaded in yellow. All those columns have lost their fireproofing, okay? That is the single biggest difference. Why am I placing more attention on what is highlighted in yellow than the red? Because we know, even with the massive loss of columns in red, The towers stabilized and didn't fall instantaneously. That means the load redistributed structurally, statically, the structure is stable as a result of the mechanical impact of the airplane. Fires have not started yet. And that's why the towers don't collapse instantaneously. They'll collapse as the fire starts weakening the remaining columns. I'll speak to that in a second. Just to give you a sense of the violence of the attack. This is the model of a single engine. And you have the model of your typical 3-story height panelized member of the exterior tube. You ram it into that triplet of facade columns. That engine only loses 15% of its momentum after it severed these humongous columns. If memory serves, Rick, they were about 3 inches thick, I think, 2 feet by 2 feet. These are massive columns, okay? Okay. A lot was said about the light truss-supported floor systems. Everything that we've done indicates, although it's plausible and likely that they are more susceptible to fire than a more traditional rolled section construction. However, the fact that they were a two-way construction system made them more resilient than one would have expected. But at the end of the day, it is not about a feeling, a belief, or what could have happened. Extensive investigation by fire engineers indicates, if you watch the video on your right, that the pattern does not show, the pattern of smoke exhausting from the towers is not consistent with the one where floors are absent, i.e. collapsed. It's more consistent with the floors being there because every window line separates into a bottom of intake of oxygen and a top where you have an exhaust of black smoke, right? That is evidence. I actually have videos and photography of both towers up to a minute pre-collapse showing fires horizontal. A fire can only be horizontal if it is supported by a slab underneath at the floors where we suspect, where our analysis indicates that the collapse initiated. Okay? So that's important to state. Okay. Rick mentioned the roof truss. The roof truss was designed to stiffen against sway, but also to support massive TV antennas. It's funny, as I talk about broadcast TV to my son, he has no clue that you can get TV out of thin air. But on that day, the roof truss played a role it was never designed for. It allowed the survival of the building for as long as it survived, and therefore the safe evacuation of the tenants below the impact floors. That roof truss acted as a load redistribution mechanism. All columns, let me start with the perimeter tube. The perimeter tube doesn't need the roof truss. It is essentially using what is known as Verendeel action, redistributes all the stresses around the hole in it very well. Remember, the building is designed for hurricane winds, right? There was no hurricane on that beautiful morning. That means less than 20% of the structural capacity of those towers was being used on that morning. All the excess capacity helped on that day. But the core columns that are severed, instead of sending their loads, that what they're carrying down to the foundation, now have to hang up, send the loads up through the roof truss where they get redistributed to go down columns that are still sound, okay? That's what I meant by the Verendil action on the perimeter tube redistributes the load. And you can see the roof truss helping. But then, 56 minutes after fires have started, we're still analyzing the load redistribution through the columns in the North Tower to check that it's still able to redistribute them. Why 56 minutes? Because that's how long the South Tower lasted. That's the reality check that we are able to understand why one collapsed at 56 minutes and not the other. But ultimately, after 102 minutes, it's way too much fire, weakening way too many columns that there simply isn't left enough capacity to carry the loads, and WTC1 comes down. And this is the actual computer analysis. This is physics, right? Not a reenactment, showing it's a core-driven, column-driven collapse first in the center that leads to pancaking, and then the exterior, of course, follows. There is a video footage. We overlay it on it. Keep your eye peeled on the TV antenna. You see it comes down first, which is consistent with a core coming down first, and then full pancaking. There is a slight difference between what happened in the North Tower and the South Tower. The North Tower, the airplane went at a more severe angle. It clipped the corner of the core. So the roof truss trying to redistribute the loads, if you want to think of it as a stool, well, it's now a stool with 3 legs rather than 4 legs. It is less able to balance loads across time, right? That is probably, that eccentricity of the damage is probably the driving reason why the South Tower lasted less than the North Tower. That initial kink that you see in videos of the top of the building is consistent with that, but ultimately, gravity is the single strongest acceleration present in the entire event, and the building comes down. Anybody who thinks only demolition leads to a downward collapse, that's not actually true. What demolition tries to do is to weaken members and let gravity do the work, which is exactly what happened here, right? Conclusions. I think I've addressed most of those issues before as I was talking, but it is important to understand there was nothing wrong with the design of the towers. Actually, their design allowed the safe evacuation of people below the impact zone. The reality is, and it would be a shame not to learn from a disaster, we learned a lot, we changed a lot, yet we do not design tall buildings to survive the impact of civilian airplanes, right? Doesn't mean we don't do anything, we do a lot. But we don't design buildings to survive airplane impacts. And I think that is important to communicate in general, to have the public understand that risk is managed, not entirely eliminated. No different than the trade-offs we do every day when we get into a car. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Aboud. I can't imagine a clear explanation of such a complicated process and analysis. That was just breathtaking. So you got a little bit of history. You got some stories. You saw how the engineering community unified and investigated not only the site, but the surrounding area. Now we have this insane mess to clean up and to continue the recovery and the healing. And Michael Burton is going to talk about his role in managing that whole process for the engineers and the contractors and doing it for the city of New York.
Thanks, Rick.
Good morning. So engineers in the normal world design buildings, and they do it to an incredibly high level of safety. But you have weeks and months to make those decisions, and someone's always checking calculations. The history of the engineers for 9/11, both during the rescue and the recovery, is all about life safety. But you only have seconds or minutes to make those same life safety decisions. I was involved with hundreds of engineers and thousands of building and construction trades over the course of both the rescue and the recovery. And there's something that they all had in common. When hundreds of thousands of people were running away from the site, they all went towards the site. They all went to help. They were both courageous and brave. And one of the things, many things changed about 9/11, and something for me that changed was a definition of courage and bravery. I always thought that you were born with it. I always thought you were in control of it. And my feeling about it now is that none of that is true. You don't have control of it. You just do things to help other people. And you do it, and it's a completely involuntary action. And you put your own health and safety at risk, and you don't even think about your family or what you may have at home, at friends and stuff like that. Everything is just a blank, and you do what you think you should be done. And that, I think, is the history of the engineers that helped at 9/11. And the proof of what they did is actually that no other life was lost after 9/11. And that's a huge, huge testament to what was done that day. If I could steal back the clicker, oh, it's right here. So that is 9/11. My day started off very, very early at 9 o'clock in the morning at a meeting at City Hall, and I was asked to go and see if we could help. We needed to find the mayor and to see if we could help out with the firefighters. That whole day was spent trying to mobilize engineers and construction contractors to help out down at the site. The picture in the top right corner is actually the first walkthrough with 4 contractors, Tully, Turner, AMEC, and Bovis, as well as Thornton Tomasetti. And those just happened to be the names of people that I knew, I trusted, and I hoped that they would respond. But nobody ever hesitated and said that they weren't going to respond. The first mission at hand was the search and rescue and doing whatever was required, getting heavy equipment down to the site in something that looked like hell. It's really the only word to describe it. One of my first thoughts was certainly, how do you keep people safe? It was just the hazards that were out there were just unimaginable. Here's just a couple of pictures from the early days, and first and foremost, for the hundreds of engineers that were mobilized, is how do you protect some of the rescue workers, some of the first responders from the hazards that were out there? Netting all the buildings. There were over 100, there were 400 buildings that were inspected by Sononi and all the other engineering companies throughout the city. Over 150 required extensive work, including netting huge amounts of the buildings that had just an unimaginable number of glass and steel that were just sitting literally cantilevered on edges. And when the wind would pick up, pieces of steel would hit the ground, pieces of glass would hit the ground, all life-threatening near misses that would constantly occur. And the weirdest thing is people would run away from when they heard stuff hitting the ground. And within a minute, they'd be back to doing what they were doing, of trying to rescue people, trying to recover people. It was just putting life and limb at risk over and over again. One of the first orders of business actually was to see how we could help the firefighters in their rescue efforts. This is a diagram of the site, and we actually carved out the site. And the only way I can describe this is like how to eat an elephant, one bite at a time. And we just carved it out for each one of the contractors. We married engineers to the contractors as we were bringing in a huge amount of heavy equipment. We set up a command and control center initially in a small schoolhouse that was mentioned earlier. We were actually sitting in a kindergarten, so it was kind of interesting that I was able to get some of the titans in our industry from the engineering world and from the construction world, and they're all sitting on chairs that were about this high. About 19 years ago, when I did a presentation, I put this slide together, and it was try to get order into my brain of what we were thinking about in that first week. And these were the top 10 things that collectively myself and the people that had worked for me put together. And each one of these, if you think about how we manage like a mega project, you put together a project management plan. And each one of these would have taken weeks to write. And it probably would have been a book about this thick. And we didn't have a book. There was no go-by. No one had ever thought that 210-story buildings would ever collapse. The first and probably the most challenging mission on day one was how do you bring in the equipment that was needed, the excavators, the cranes, the trucks. How do you bring them in at the same time the police department and the FBI were trying to keep people out? All the bridges and tunnels were shut down coming into the city, so just bringing in cranes. So we established merging points where people would bring the cranes in from New Jersey, bring the cranes in from Long Island and Queens, bring in the excavators. They'd all park in there, then we'd arrange for police escorts to bring them over the bridges. The same thing happened to workers. The same thing happened with the engineers that initially helped with the initial assessment. We'd have mustering points, and they'd all have to be brought in with police escorts. Clearing a path, that's actually the West Side Highway, as you can see from that picture right there, completely blocked off, and we needed to clear that to gain access for the cranes and for the trucks. Here's something that was developed very, very early on. There's a huge amount of voids and large areas below the surface for both path, for all the major buildings in the area. And if we had ever driven a crane over those areas, we would have had a collapsed crane causing further loss of life. So the engineers actually choreographed where the cranes would move every day, and the cranes would not move without getting an engineering sign-off. As far as building inspections, 400 buildings were actually assessed for structural stability. Over 150 were worked on, and that was largely Sononi and a huge amount of engineers, hundreds of engineers that helped out in the assessments. Once they were prioritized, as was mentioned earlier, and then once they were prioritized, contractors implemented emergency measures to secure their safety. Paths and subways were also a major issue. The path trains, I should say. There we go. Organization was super important. How do you organize and get, on 9/11, there were several thousand volunteers that were there. How do you organize that, and how do you get everybody marching to the same drum or trying to pull the wagon in the same direction? So we started off with organizational meetings where we met every day. Here's another slide of the buildings that were assessed. Very, very similar to what was mentioned earlier, a color-coded system of what was safe, what was not safe. As far as the contract, we started with no contracts. Then it was me telling people, promising that they would get paid. A letter of authorization was issued within about a week, telling people to proceed. And as I mentioned last night, I asked the mayor for 4 $10 million checks. So in today's terms, that probably would have been about $80 million or $100 million. And I asked the mayor for the checks, and the next day I had them in my hand. Dust suppression was huge. The fires actually burned for more than 90 days. Another concern was actually the trucks, 60-yard containers, 40-yard containers, a number of trucks to remove over 1 million tons of debris. Someone was going to get hurt by those trucks, so how did we do it? So we actually dredged, within 2 weeks, we started dredging the Hudson River to allow a barging operation to resume. A little bit about perimeter security. Initially, all the way up to 14th Street in Lower Manhattan was you were not allowed in, and there was a badging system to get people in. So just constant logistics of making sure the right people were there and nobody else got hurt. This is the slurry wall. As you can see, it moved 4.5 feet in one damaged section. Here's another picture towards the end of what was impacted. There's a story one day of a meeting, and I know I told the story last night, but for those online, the ground started moving one day, and the slurry wall was moving. The impact of that would have been the Hudson River literally flooding out the tunnels. I don't actually have video on this, but
these walls hold back the river. So if these walls cave in, this place is going to get flooded out by the river.
There was sort of a valley sitting out in here between the wall and the South Tower. All the collapse had gone down to track level. So we had 60, 70 feet of wall, totally unsupported.
Engineers would secure the slurry wall using a system of tieback anchors. They drilled steel pipes at an angle into the slurry wall, reaching down as deep as 120 feet to bedrock. Long steel cables were then inserted into the pipes. At times, water burst through the tieback holes without warning, leaving little doubt how effective the slurry wall was in holding back the river. Grout pumped into the pipes cemented the ends of the steel cables into bedrock. The wall was forced back and locked off.
This is just some pictures of the site of actually what it looked like and how things progressed. As you can see from the picture in the lower right-hand side, the number of cranes actually that were on site. At peak, we had 150 cranes and excavators that were actually operating and helping in both the rescue and the recovery effort. Here you can see pictures of the West Side Highway. Critical to the project of actually just getting access to helping the rescue and the recovery effort was opening up the West Side Highway. First, there was a temporary highway put. Then we actually reconstructed the entire West Side Highway. So I would say between the reconstruction of the West Side Highway and all the utility work that had to be done, and it wasn't just utility work to get the immediate repairs done, like immediate repairs to water mains to help fight the fires, repairing telecommunications to get communications up in Lower Manhattan, but it was also rebuilding the permanent infrastructure. As we're carrying out the recovery process, there was probably $500 to $600 million worth of infrastructure that was done simultaneously with the recovery process to make that happen. So it was a huge, huge management effort, just coordinating the telecommunications companies, coordinating the power companies, coordinating with DEP, with the water mains and the sewer mains. So that was all kind of, if you want to call it a sideshow, because it was much less important, but it was important for when the site was finally cleared up to allow the permanent construction of the towers to go up, as you saw from Carla talking earlier. This is towards the end of actually the cleanup. You can still see the last remaining column, sole remaining column. And this was, we're not getting cooperation from technology here, but this is the turnover ceremony. It was over 262 days to actually to complete the cleanup, and that was the kickoff to the construction. Here you can see what I think is just an absolutely magnificent comparison of what it looked like versus what the Port Authority did and Carla did in creating a super, super world-class space that balances the commercial aspects, it balances the historic aspects of it, and it also balances the fact that it is still a graveyard for many, many, many people. Something I think every engineer on the site should be very, very proud of is there were no recovery fatalities. And that's something that when I think about 9/11, and it's a very, very sad and somber place in many people's hearts and minds, the fact that our community of engineers was successful at a drastic, dire time and nobody else passed away is just truly a testament to engineers going above and beyond the call of duty. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Before we go on, I do want to say that we will probably be 15, 20 minutes long on this. We encourage everyone to stay both here in the room and online because the best is yet to come, really. We've learned about the history. We saw how the engineering community came together. We learned how the towers collapsed, the mechanism. Mike brought us to the point where this site has been recovered and we're starting to heal, and now we're going to be uplifted even further by the redevelopment. Okay, and now to wrap up our presentation, we're going to learn a little bit about how what you saw in that wonderful video clip was actually accomplished. And Carla's going to come back and talk about the new World Trade Center in general terms, in architectural terms, and then Jeff Smilo will come and talk about structural engineering aspects of the rebuilding.
Okay, that clip is always amazing. Oh, thank you. That. And it covered more than a decade in 2 minutes, so I'm going to freeze frame through some of the elements to provide context and insight over the planning, design, and construction of the last 19 years. Again, it's important to understand from the Port Authority perspective, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we were mourning our colleagues. We were assisting in the recovery with Mike and his team. We worked at relocating all of our staff, whether it was to New York and New Jersey, to get them back working. We established a three-prong approach to the redevelopment. And we called that approach the Downtown Restoration Program. The first was to bring back transportation as quickly as possible because it impacted the economic recovery of Lower Manhattan. The second was that we needed to take back the site and prepare it for construction so that we could move forward. And finally was the development of the master plan and bringing together all of the entities and stakeholders and to work through the planning and the legal and the property issues that made this site so complex as compared to the original World Trade Center. So this is an image of the spring of 2002 as Mike was finishing the recovery with his team. And one of my roles was to work with Mike and his team to transition the site to us. And the Port Authority did take it back on July 8th and through a certificate of occupancy process, which was the first of many permits that we have issued throughout the past 19 years. So we did, in fact, have to create a fencing system and a perimeter that was appropriate for the reconstruction, which was a little different than what was appropriate for recovery. We also negotiated with DOT because we had to keep certain streets closed for the long term, Vesey and Liberty, and we had to work through that process. And we also had to reestablish the security system. And we were fortunate in that we had a badging system in place pre-9/11, which I failed to mention earlier in history, that allowed us to take that and adapt it for use for the construction. The other thing I wanted to mention, which was really important, and I believe it was August 26th, we raised the first column for the temporary path station, and Frank Lombardi, who many of you know is a chief engineer, felt it was really important to have a blessing ceremony to give the site a rebirth and another way to look forward. And that was a really meaningful, small ceremony, but I think, worthwhile to mention that the human aspect is always on our minds as we move forward to try to rebuild. And these are the ways that we do that to try to associate. Another important milestone is 2003. The Port Authority designed the temporary station ourselves. And I know we love to use consultants, but at that time we did a lot of the work ourselves. And we were charged with bringing it back November 2003. And we did do that and accomplished that. I did want to, of course, remind you the Port Authority remained the owner of the site, and Silverstein Properties, as the net lessee, had control over the commercial redevelopment. And another organization was formulated, Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, that was a combination of the city of New York and the state of New York. And their charge was to work with the memorial and cultural facilities and really work with the families to bring that along. Another important point, we say from September 12th, we started planning and looking forward. We looked at transportation and the idea of seamless connections for pedestrians from river to river. And this was an important point that I believe we've achieved. And we felt we had the need, as I told you, neighborhood changed over time and needs of people changed over time, that we were able to bring people on board, and we had to bring a lot of entities on board, whether it was Battery Park City, whether it was the Manhattan Borough President's Office, on board to this idea that we could and should connect transportation from river to river. And we also worked with MTA at that time, our engineering department, their engineering department, to talk about where there would be opportunities to do that. Okay. I want to make one point. We spent, and people know this, like $300 million building the temporary path station as a short-term initiative. And we did move around the entrance several times throughout construction. But it's really important to understand in these large-scale developments that there have to be short-term initiatives and long-term initiatives. And there is phasing. And there are costs that will be borne that aren't always recouped, because ultimately the big development costs around $15 billion. But you just can't go in and put everything in place the first time. Things do have to grow and change, and that is the value of a master plan. Right here on this slide, just trying to give you an idea of the different construction that was going on. But what's really important here, and I neglected to mention it in the history, is that we had a west bathtub. Over 350 years ago, that western bathtub that held the Twin Towers was the Hudson River. And the edge, the water's edge, was Greenwich Street. And we often had arguments through this development that certain people wanted the beach back because of the elevation of the site. And so when Mike talked about that river coming through, I mean, the river was there. And what happened with our development initially is that we created 23 acres of landfill that became Battery Park City. So keep that in mind. What we found, because we had so much program to accommodate and include, and also the memorial, we needed to create 2 more bathtubs. What happened was we kept the west side for the memorial and the train tracks and whatever other infrastructure like cooling plants that would be required. The east side became the bathtub for the commercial development. Pre-9/11, that area was only about 2 levels deep. We actually went down, created another bathtub going down 6 levels. That's another like 4 acres of land. And then we created a south bathtub. That is where Deutsche Bank building was. We needed that south bathtub for the vehicle security center that I referred to, the place where the servicing vehicles could enter the facility, and the limited tenant parking cars we would allow, where they could enter that facility and traverse underground. And that third south bathtub, we ended up having to bifurcate and build in 2 phases because it took a while for the Deutsche Bank building to be deconstructed. And also, it's important to note that the MTA 1 line bifurcates our site, and that's more or less where Greenwich Street is, where the old edge of Manhattan was. And we constantly had to deal with those 3 bathtubs, and then the idea that we would underpin the MTA subway line. And originally, we only looked at underpinning about 300 feet to accommodate the connection for the transit system, the transportation hub, but ultimately we underpinned and we needed all of the space, the full 1,000-foot length. And that was a huge undertaking. You see that in this lower left slide. We're starting to show the 300 feet for that connection of the Calatrava building, but we needed all of it. This is showing you us at the peak of construction in 2010. Everybody was building on the site. People were at different levels of design, but everybody was building something. We probably had about 5,000 construction workers a day. And again, safety was critically important. It's come up several times in the different aspect of the work that has occurred on this site. But for us, construction safety was critical. We didn't want to have any fatalities. There were daily monitoring and incident studies, and it was very important to us. The Port Authority was responsible for building the streets and sidewalks, the memorial, the Freedom Tower, and the Vehicle Security Center. And Silverstein at that time was building Tower 4. Along the way in 2010, we, entered into a revised master development agreement with Silverstein, and the Port Authority ended up taking back the Freedom Tower, which we now call One World Trade Center, and we took back Site 5. Silverstein kept Towers 2, 3, and 4. And so that was a big change in the development in terms of how the work would progress. And it was agreed as well that Towers 2, 3, and 4 would be phased based on market demand and finances. Go to the next. This is essentially 2014, and we are back to life. We changed the name from Freedom Tower to One World Trade Center. Condé Nast moved in. That was a huge game changer for us. And the Port Authority corporate offices, we moved into 4 World Trade Center. You can see everything, and of course the memorial had its 10th anniversary, and we opened limited areas for access to the fountains while we still continue to construct around it. Two more points I want to make here. Along the way, when we started this development, and we put back Fulton and Greenwich Street, it created a grid to reintegrate the project into the city. Security and vehicular security was always very important. And around 2010, we came to an agreement with the city that this site would be closed. We still had Fulton and Greenwich Street. What we did was to create 8 sally ports, what we call them here, around the site, some for entrance and some for exit, that would allow only vehicles permitted to be there to come through. This gave us a heightened sense of security. It also ended up helping to create the site as a more pedestrian site. So if you are ever there, get to walk through, you'll notice people are crossing the streets anywhere they feel like it, and they really don't have, their risk is limited or mitigated due to vehicles. We also, of course, had cooling facilities. We put back the central chiller plant that was drawing river water, but much smaller. What happened was the commercial towers, Silverstein decided to feed those through traditional cooling towers, but the low-rise buildings, whether it's the transportation hub, the Memorial Museum, the Performing Arts Center, the Greek Orthodox Church, for those buildings, we brought back the chilled water plant because no one really wants to see cooling towers on beautiful little iconic buildings. And so that is where, and so these facilities have a high first cost, but lower operational costs. When you're a developer, you want lower first costs and maybe the long-term costs, you don't care about. You put that on the tenant. And so again, those were huge discussions to get through with all of the parties to come to agreement so we could actually figure out who needed what space. Superstorm Sandy 2012, huge issue for us. 125 million gallons entered the site at the low point where the VSC was under construction at the corner of Cedar and West Street, and some up at the low point near Tower 1, Vesey and West. It basically delayed or impacted our construction by a couple of years. I mean, a lot of the equipment we had put in for the transportation hub was damaged and had to be replaced. We went on and we created a very robust resiliency program, about a $100 million program, where we used the bollard system as a first line of defense and then created other ways to protect the entrance to the building that I think is very successful today. Talk a little bit about iconic architecture because it's everywhere on our site. In the past, there were 2 towers and the sculptures. Today, practically every building is an icon in and of itself. The One World Trade Center, of course, with this height of 1776, and the antenna that helps us get there, and the cascading towers, which I didn't mention. The towers cascade downward from the low point of what would be Tower 5 to the high point of 1776, and they frame the memorial. The memorial itself with those pools are iconic. They're beautiful remembrances of the former footprints. We have Calatrava's transportation hub, that beautiful white building, a dove taking off in flight was his concept. What can I say more about that? And we have also other low-rise buildings that are iconic. The other way it's different is these towers have about 8 million square feet of space, where in the past we had about 10 million square feet. This is Liberty Park, and probably one of my favorite features is being responsible for the streetscape program and the master plan. This is a special place. What's nice about this is the VSC, the loading dock entry, is an important piece of infrastructure. What we were able to do was essentially create a green roof and design a park on top of that roof for the community. Another important point, we all know that the memorial and the museum were critically important for us to remember those who died that day. The community also lived in the neighborhood. Remember I said the neighborhood grew from not having any residents to having about, well, I don't want to misquote the number, a lot of residents. And they wanted a place where they could go and relax or have events and have it be different from the memorial, but to acknowledge that memorial. And this park does a couple of things. It acts as a bridge, spans east to west, which was important. It makes a connection to Brookfield Place. It also has an overlook that looks at the memorial so that if you want to get it from another vantage point, it's a lovely vantage point. You're about 25 feet above the memorial. And we also created these monumental steps, which is another, I find it a popular planning or architectural idea. You'll see them sometimes scattered throughout the city, where people can sit on the steps and gather. They can still look forward towards the memorial, but it's a more casual environment. And we also have in this park, it's become the Port Authority's almost memorial park. We have an Anne Frank tree from, there's a sapling from the original tree outside of her window that has been dedicated here. We have America's Response statue that's been dedicated. We just, yesterday morning, dedicated this memorial garden. Let's try to use my, I don't want to mess it up, but and we just dedicated that yesterday for the Port Authority first responders who passed subsequent to 9/11. And of course, There have been many, and we wanted an opportunity to recognize that and the 20th anniversary, and the fact that my team was able to finish that park in record time allowed us to do that. So I think we're very proud of that. Here's a section. I was talking to you about the bollards and Hurricane Sandy, and understand. Let me see if I can do it. No, I'll mess it up. That's showing you how we can institute flood resiliency on a temporary basis and then take it away when the storm threat is gone. And actually, ACEC New York gave us an Engineering Excellence Award with Baker Engineering, who designed this for us a few years ago. So I think that's really nice that you guys recognized that. Okay, a little bit about current and future architecture. Over time, sometimes projects evolve that you don't first even envision, like I mentioned, the Memorial Garden. We have here the Memorial Glade for first responders that opened a couple of years ago. We're also in the middle of construction now with both of the buildings, the Performing Arts Center and the Greek Church, St. Nicholas Greek Church, or National Shrine. And those should both be finished sometime next year, with the Performing Arts Center opening in 2023. And what's really beautiful about these, and that's why there are night views, is that they will act as lanterns. And one is actually at the north end of the site, and one is at the south end of the site. And they're actually in line with the edge of the memorial. And I think it will be really beautiful way to frame, if you will, the memorial. We have two things going on in terms of framing. That's my architecture. The memorial, of course, is the center. We then have these low-rise buildings that form a linear line, if you will, north to south. And then the commercial towers frame it more or less in an L, and their heights cascade downward. Again, everything looking towards the memorial, which is really part of our purpose. I should just go back. No, I'll leave it like this. On Site 5, you probably are aware that is being developed by Empire State Development Corporation. It is planned to now be a residential building. We'll basically transfer that over where they actually have the land, we don't, for Site 5. And so that will not technically be part of the master plan as originally envisioned. I'm showing you here the master plans. This is on the left, Liebeskin's original plan that was developed in October of 2003, and he later, for the next 6 months, worked with Port Authority staff and engineering to really understand the site and its constraints. The middle is version 12 of the master plan. We've had 12 versions over the years. We just finished this one October 2020 during COVID to upgrade for the Performing Arts Center. But really there isn't much change between the two. There are little tweaks here and there, but I think it's a testament to the fact that we had a strong master plan, we had people who believed in it, and we had design guidelines. But all of it was tied in legal agreements, which is really very important when one is starting these multi-use, multi-stakeholder developments, that you do need the legal agreements to keep people focused, and you also need people like me to hound them when they want to deviate, because over time, people's agendas do, and their priorities do change. I mean, we are human, and we probably know that in our own lives, but we had to hold fast. I think one of my maybe proudest achievements that I'll share is when Kolochov and Liebeskin first had to meet, I was the one to put that together. And what we knew was Liebeskin had the wedge of light being from the first plane hitting to the last one falling, and his wedge was an open space. When Calatrava came along with his beautiful transportation hub that the Port Authority just knew that was the right solution, he actually took a piece of the wedge of light and made it the building. So that line was actually that last plane. And what's beautiful about this is that it makes it alive. You know, you walk through that transportation hub and you can see the skylight, and we, you know, sometimes open it on certain occasions. It really enlivened it, and the plaza became the space around it. So that was an exciting day, a small group of people, those two, you know, Starchitects, talking without any pictures and without any drawings. And sometimes that's the best way to get people to collaborate and come to a common understanding. And once we did that, then everyone was able to reveal and share their drawings. And the last diagram there is an overlay of the former World Trade Center and the new, because I also think, you know, there are many ways to create a design. Architects look at problems, they have many ways to solve them, and their creativity comes to fore. In the 60s, superblocks were important, no neighborhood. Today, in 2000, there is a neighborhood. The street grid is important. The integration of people and cars and everyone mixing is sort of foremost in planners and architects' minds. And so this kind of reflects different solutions for the same problems. And lastly, in conclusion, as I just said, we have restored all of the functions, and we added the memorial and museum. What I find most interesting is that everything old is new again. It depends just how one looks at it. You know, many of the functions of the past are still necessary today. What was innovative back in the 60s and 70s became commonplace. Today, in our new complex, we have new innovations, whether it was top-down construction, whether it was how we were hardening buildings, introducing glazing, looking at resiliency and how we could incorporate it in a creative way and not destroy the architecture and the sense of place. We have many opportunities always as engineers and architects to make things newer and better, as others have said throughout this discussion. And the last point also is that originally the Trade Center was at the edge of Western Manhattan. Remember I said there was nothing there was just a highway. Today it's more in the center because of the Battery Park City community. And again, over time, we see how land changes, weather changes, and we adapt. So I'm very proud of where we are today, and I'm looking forward to us finishing. Larry is talking about possibly starting Tower 2. We'll see how that evolves. I think he has gone back to Norman Foster, so I personally am happy about that. That was a beautiful building, and we'll see what the future holds. And I'm turning it over now to Jeff, who's going to give you all of that engineering techno talk that you can tell I don't talk that way.
Thank you, Colin. Does this thing work?
I think so, but you know, I'm not.
Let's give it a shot. Which button is it? The green?
Green is go, and I'm not sure red is stop.
I can't see it. There we go. Okay, I'm Jeff Smilo, and we'll wrap up talking a bit about engineering, but I'm gonna try to keep it a little down to earth. We were I'm the structural director at WSP USA, and WSP was the engineer of record for the for Tower 1, Tower 2, Tower 3, the memorial, the museum, the foundation of the PAC. I know I left something out. And 7. And frankly, as you heard from Rick, we used to work together. In 1977, my first job was working for Les Robertson. That was after the Trade Center was, of course, completed. And I had the honor and the privilege of learning and working for him until I joined the predecessor firm of WSP, which was the office of Irwin Cantor, and that became WSP, and that's where I am now. What's most interesting about the engineering is Les Robertson set the standard for high-rise engineering. With his work, as you heard Rick describe, with his work on the World Trade, on the original World Trade Center, and that had to do with, of course, wind tunnel testing and estimating motions that would be sensitive to the occupants of high-rise buildings, systems, structural systems that became the standard or one of the standards for high-rise buildings. But the rebuilding of Ground Zero set a new standard that's being used throughout the world and throughout the USA and for high-rise construction. So the World Trade Center site in its original form and it's in the current new form has continued to set the standard for engineering. So let's talk a bit about that. Okay, you saw this a few times, and since we're late, I won't dwell on this too much. But the first building to be rebuilt was Tower 7. I worked on the first tower in the early first version in the early 1980s. Oh, is that right? Okay. So I worked on the first tower, and then I worked on the rebuilding. And of course, Tower 7 was not the tallest of any of the buildings. It was the shortest. But it started to lay the groundwork for what a new tower should have from a security standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, and this relates to the use of concrete cores, which was not common at all in the industry, especially in New York. And there's a whole discussion of how you build a concrete core. We'll talk about that in a bit. But Tower 7 luckily moved ahead quickly, and the rebuilding took place quickly. I also worked on the study of the Deutsche Bank, or the Deutsche Bank building, or it was known at the time as 130 Liberty. The Bankers Trust building had various names. And that was, I think you saw the picture earlier, heavily damaged. Literally, we were in that building as soon as we got downtown, 2 days, working with the owners and discussing how fast we could clean out the debris, repair the damage, which was severe, and get the building working again. Well, as it turned out, that didn't happen that way, mainly because of the contamination from the asbestos contaminating everything in the building, and they chose just to demolish it. But what was most interesting, and you learn things from every situation in life, disasters included, we had to monitor that building. There was a nor'easter coming. I think it was roughly in October or November, and it was heading straight for New York. The building was severely damaged. It had a perimeter moment frame system that lost one face. We studied it extensively, we modeled it, there were monitoring systems in place, and there truly was a fear that if that storm came, the building would collapse, and had a direct line, of course, with police and fire to evacuate the neighborhood, and luckily it didn't come to that. And we modeled it, and the building performed pretty close to the model, to what our model showed. So, and there was a plan to rebuild it, but they chose, of course, in the end, to just demolish it. So let's move on. What's most interesting, does this work? What's most interesting was, okay, we embarked on the reconstruction of Tower 1. Well, what code do you use? New York City code really hasn't changed much since 1938 and then 1968. And here we are, we're going to rebuild after a terrible disaster. We want to use the latest and the latest innovation with materials, standards for wind engineering, standards for security. Engineers can't work without codes. There's no code. Luckily, the Port Authority was in control, because legally the Port Authority had the legal right to set its own standard and not follow any code. So there was extensive discussions about what's the right code to use. We implemented at that time the standards for wind from the IBC code, which was not at the time part of the New York approved codes. Ultimately, it became that, and it was slightly modified. But the bottom line was, codes are a minimum standard. The engineers from our company, working with the Port Authority, set a new standard. That new standard became New York City's standard for the most part, except for security. A lot of the security issues are voluntary and not code dictates. And you could see all this come together in other parts of Manhattan, especially in Hudson Yards, where there's a whole load of new buildings going up. And what we've developed downtown is now setting the standard on the super tall buildings in the other parts of the city. So the critical structural issues, you heard a lot about the bathtub. This was a very big deal, and most people don't realize this. If you go throughout the world, in any major underground facility, it's broken up in expansion joints. There's temperature changes, expansion and contractions. You have to relieve the stresses somewhere. Well, we didn't. We didn't want to, and we did extensive engineering on both the west and east bathtubs on eliminating all expansion joints, make it one massive structure that interacted with the slurry walls, because it's the diaphragms that brace the slurry walls, and receive the wind loads from the towers, Towers 1, Towers 2, Tower 3, Tower 4, and the West bathtub, which only had Tower 1, and the temperature stresses, and it performs, and to this day, very well. And it's doing its job. And it was really an accomplishment. And it's a big savings, because when you break up a site like this with expansion joints, they leak. Not from the river water, but from rainwater. And they cause deterioration. We see it in bridges all over the world. Bridges have expansion joints, and it's a maintenance headache. Well, if you don't have the joints, you don't have the headache. And you don't have drip pans all over subway ceilings, right? So this was a great accomplishment, and a lot of effort went into that. Of course, you heard about the tiebacks. There was a liner wall that covered it all up after. And the tiebacks, we see it, and it held up till after the collapse, but they're not really meant to last forever. After every bathtub, and by the way, I don't know why we call it a bathtub, we should call it a boat, because the water's on the outside, and the inside's supposed to be dry. But in any case, we call it a bathtub. So the tiebacks are not meant to last forever, because when a bathtub is built, you have your interior diaphragms, and they brace the walls, and you don't need your tiebacks. But we see the tiebacks did last. So then, and all of this relates, of course, to the towers, the foundation, the below-grade structures. The Port Authority was instrumental of developing high-strength, real high-strength concrete for use at Tower 1, and now it's used throughout the city. 14,000 PSI concrete was studied and developed by Cass. And he was, I don't know what his title was, but he was instrumental in controlling the study of it and working together with the design engineers from WSP and finally putting it to use in Tower 1. 12,000 and 14,000 PSI, which was unheard of in New York. And now, again, go throughout Manhattan. Every engineer is using that high-strength concrete. What most people, I guess the layman's not familiar with, we've used high-strength concrete over the years in New York, but it was old-fashioned. What does that mean? It was a lot of cement to achieve the high strength. Well, those of us who work with concrete, if you, you put a lot of cement in concrete and have thick foundations and heavy foundations, you could fry eggs on your mass concrete during after placement. And you can't tolerate that level of heat in that a 14,000 PSI concrete would develop. But properly engineered 14,000 PSI concrete does not develop severe heat of hydration, and that's a tremendous success because of the Port Authority's innovative thinking. Move on. I think you saw this already. I'm repeating many of the slides showing the areas of our work. But this outlines the west bathtub and the east bathtub and the west bathtub. It was divided by the subway that passes through the middle, and this massive area was engineered without expansion joints. And this is what you heard earlier. The west bathtub was the tower, the memorial, the museum. The east bathtub was the commercial development. Each had its own demands placed on the below grade and the diaphragms, and we dealt with that successfully. Now let's go up to the towers. The towers, the first need was high-strength concrete, very high-strength concrete, and I mentioned how we got to that point. The second need was, was a first major implementation of a concrete core in New York City for security and for basic stability of the building. There was a big debate about should it be core first or steel first? And we're still going through that debate throughout New York City. And you've seen pictures of, and the Tower 3 had proceeded with the core first logic, in which the core rises ahead of the rest of the structure, and the steel follows. The Tower 2, Tower 1, Tower 2 wasn't built yet, but the foundation was. Tower 1 followed with the steel first logic, You build a steel frame first, a minor, relatively minor frame in the core, and then cover it with concrete a number of floors below the top. So it lags. It's steel first, concrete second. So like I say, Tower 1 was steel first, concrete second. Tower 3 was concrete first, steel second. And Tower 2 was planned as a steel first. We'll see what happens when they bring it back. It's not up to the architect. And we've developed new systems, or let's call it advance the linkages at doorways. We call it link beams. We call it ring beams. We'll show you some pictures of it. We put it to use in different forms at the various towers downtown. And then there's the redundancy aspects. And again, the codes don't dictate this. This is a security issue. And each building handles it differently, downtown versus uptown. What happens? What do you plan for in terms of removal through any mechanism, removal of structure? And how do you build in a redundancy, an alternate load path that goes by various names? So this is something that, again, it's not fully dictated by codes, and there's a lot of input from police and other agencies, depending upon where structures are. And you can imagine downtown had lots of discussion about the level of redundancy, the level of security. And one thing I failed to mention, the development of the cores, the cores on all the towers downtown, set the standard for safety during, of course, an evacuation, of special elevators for firemen, lighting in the cores, smoke evacuation in the cores. Everything had to be adjusted, and all of this was learned from the disaster at grounds at the World Trade Center of what is needed to maintain a safe evacuation. So digging in a little bit into, and I know we're running very late, digging in a little bit to the special aspects here. Tower 1, I think we know who was involved with it. Let's skip this slide. Tower 1 was a combination structural system, concrete core, a perimeter moment frame. It's a little analogous to the perimeter tube that you heard a lot about, but nothing like the perimeter tube at the original towers. The original towers had a very tight Varandale, we call it a tight Varandale frame. Columns were very closely spaced. It achieved a very rigid structure. Well, this is a combination of, let's call it a less tight perimeter column system, all interconnected, a moment frame, which is a Varandale frame, and supplemented by a true concrete core. And that forms what we call the hybrid lateral force resisting system. Well, whatever I'm supposed to point to, there we go. And of course, wind tunnel studies were performed on all the high-rise buildings downtown. What's most interesting, and again, most people don't realize, we're concerned about when you do the wind tunnel study for multiple purposes. One, to get a proper estimation of wind. You get the climatic data, you know which directions are more severe than others, you're able to develop the proper load combinations. But also, you're studying building motion. What do the occupants feel during a severe wind event? And what will be upsetting? It's not a question of safety. From safety, we engineer for the high wind forces, and that's covered. It's a lower level of force that could achieve a high degree of vibration, which upsets the occupants. And what is that? And where is that? So at the World Trade Center, there's a shot that I'd like to show. If I could find it. You'll study motions at the highest level where people are working. Not at the roof, because no one's sitting at the roof at a desk doing work. So in residential buildings, the upper floors may be mechanical, and you'll study motions at the level where people live. In an office building, it's the same thing. We don't concern ourselves with amenity spaces, et cetera. So World Trade Center, the Tower 1 we know is 1,776 feet tall to the top of the antenna. That's not the issue. The highest level of office occupancy is 1,100 feet up. So, and that's the level that was studied, and it was determined we didn't need any damper devices to maintain motions within tolerable limits. We'll find that photograph eventually. So the concrete first, steel first issue is this ongoing debate. I have a picture of, I didn't put it in here, it'll take too much time, but it's a time-lapse video of two buildings in Upper Manhattan going up, identical in height, but 1,000 feet tall, and one was steel first, one was concrete first, and there's a whole debate between the two owners, different owners, that we beat you. But it's hard to understand who beat who. So here's Tower 7 under construction. Now, what we know, Tower 7 had the substation, the Carnegie substation that was destroyed, and of course it was rebuilt with the new substation, and we reused the foundations, the original foundations. Here's pictures of the new construction, the slurry walls at the right. The Tower 1 is a very it's simple but very interesting, and it's a perfect structure. The chamfered corners form a ridge line that bring down significant amount of the tower loads, because you can see every column will, most columns will eventually hit the ridge in the corner. And that ridge comes down to the truss, these trusses at the base, which play a large role, a significant role in redundancy and spanning over entrances. And this ridge force comes to this corner, and you can imagine the building of this size, the force to this corner is tremendous. So the steel is obviously tremendous. And the component, I have a few pictures of this. These components are in excess of 2,000 pounds a foot, and some more than that. The erection was a true challenge. So here's the base, and the corner. This is what I was referring to. The ridge columns come to this point, and they're supported on a local small truss, small in terms of not as large a span, but very heavy structure. This was assembled on site, and most from here to here was assembled on site and lifted up in one piece. You can see it. This is quite long, and the joints are welded together. And you can't bolt these things together. They're solid steel for the most part. Here you can see cross sections. They're mostly solid steel. And you can see here's a shot of the erection of these elements. Those that are not solid steel are not small either. What we typically do, the largest conventional rolled shape is give or take 800 pounds a foot, and with these plates, it almost doubles the weight. So you get close to 2,000 pounds a foot. Tower 2, which is not built, this is the first version. There was a second version. And maybe we'll come back to the first version. But the foundation is built, and there was a tenant that came along a number of years ago and wanted to reconfigure the whole building. And the challenge was you could reconfigure the building, but it has to meet the foundations that are in place. So that was a major challenge. This is the framing system. Again, the entire perimeter is a redundant structure. Again, this is not dictated by code, but it's dictated by the location. And of course, the concrete core and the ring beam, which plays a very important role from an engineering standpoint, is this perimeter ring of steel that supports the floor framing. And there's different techniques for that. Many projects at Tower 3 went with a slightly different technique of having embedded plates, but that results in lots of field welding. The ring beam concept allows the concrete to be placed next to the beam, yet it encapsulates the beam. The primary tower is this segment. This is just the podium elements of it. The lateral system concept is similar. The concrete core is the primary system. The perimeter beams forming a rigid Vierendeel supplement it to form a hybrid lateral system. And yes, there is a linkage at the top. Both the Tower 1 and Tower 2 and Tower 3 have it. We call it a crown. It's a space truss linking the core to the perimeter. And there's the foundations that were going in. Tower 3 is under construction here with the core first concept coming out of the ground. Tower 2 is over here, and the hub is here. The dog bone, we call this the dog bone connection that was developed in the seismic environment, and under extreme events, they route the stresses to the right locations instead of having stresses develop in other areas. So these are allowed to yield, and the performance of the structure is more controlled. Tower 3 is interesting. This design has evolved also. It originally had large X-bracing on the perimeter. What was most interesting, and I think you'll see it here, the core is quite large.
Could you, when you step away, could you use that?
Okay, gotcha. The core.
Also try to wrap it up.
Yep. The core is quite large. X-bracing originally was somewhat unnecessary, and it was removed, but it's truly unnecessary. We still have a perimeter moment frame working in combination with the core. What the main challenge on this building was, this perimeter system, as you see here, of expressed diagonal elements is exposed to temperature changes. So between summer and winter, you're dealing with literally almost 100-degree temperature change. If that steel, even though it's clad, it's not heated in the winter, and in the summer it gets pretty hot in there, in between the steel within the corner cladding. And over 1,000 feet, this steel expands and contracts a tremendous amount, and there's no expansion joints. It was engineered to resist all that expansion and contraction without ripping apart the curtain wall that wraps on the inside of it. So there's connections that penetrate the curtain wall, come out to that perimeter exposed steel. And but that steel does play a very important role in redundancy should there be an unforeseen event that would damage the structure. Let's try to wrap up. Again, wind tunnel studies. Again, no damper devices were needed for these buildings. Just a photograph of the exposed bedrock conditions. Here's the Tower 3 core, concrete first coming out of the ground. And there's the link beams. Above doorways, we typically use steel link beams. They're 7 times stronger, 7 to 10 times stronger than concrete, so they do the job better. And what's most interesting, the ductwork passes above the beam to get out into the exterior spaces, so it doesn't impact the ceiling. Passes above the beam and goes in between the filler beams. And that wraps it up. Here's a picture during construction, and another picture of the completed tower, and a beautiful rendering, but one day this building will take its place amongst the others. Thank you.
So thank you all. Thank you for your patience. We have gone long, but we must never forget the brutal losses we suffered. More importantly, we must find ways to actively remember. So we are happy that you have all shared in ACEC New York's remembrance of the power and healing brought by the unity of our profession and unity of the construction industry and our government. So thank you, Carla Bonacci, Vicky Arbitrio, Najib Aboud, Jeffrey Smilo, and returning, Michael Burton. So thank you all. And this closes our 2021 Fall Conference. We thank you all for joining us. And we do have lots of events coming up in the coming year. Please check our website. Thank you.
There's only like a 2-foot difference in whether you'd be able to see it or not see it, right?